Well, Ken and ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for those kind words of introduction. And I am here on behalf of the City Council and the people of Toronto. I only saw one City Councillor that was here, and there may be others, and I apologize. They can get me a note up while I'm speaking. But Councillor Joe Cressy is here. I can tell you that he is a terrific new addition to the Toronto City Council. I hope he'd say that about me as well, because I'm new also. But he is a terrific new addition to City Council, and I'm delighted that he's here today. I will tell you that upon reflection, it is easier to be the chair of CivicAction than it is to be the mayor of Toronto. You get the opportunity to do some city building and to comment on city affairs without having as much in the way of accountability. And you don't get things like the experience I had last week when I put a pocket square in my suit for the Toronto Raptors. It was a Raptors thing with a logo, and after they lost the first two games, the media asked me whether I was thinking I should be taking this out, and I was outraged at this suggestion. I thought this was the mark of a fair-weather sailor, and I hope they didn't think I was one of those. After 3 losses, on the theory that no good deed can go unpunished, they asked me if it was possible I was jinxing the team by wearing this pocket square. I was half expecting after they lost the series, unfortunately on the weekend, they'd suggest I should resign. But having said all that, that maybe gives you a small illustration of the difference between being the head of CivicAction and now being the mayor of Toronto. But I am very happy to be here. I'm so proud to have had the opportunity to be associated with this organization from its inception because I think it does so much good. And I'm certainly continuing to rely on not just CivicAction, but this summit as an opportunity to give us some of the guidance we need, all of you, on how to take things forward. And so I do want to begin by saying thank you to CivicAction generally, to the summit, to those of you who've taken the time, but also to the CivicAction team. I know them better than most in this room because I had a chance to be their volunteer leader for a number of years, was part of the selection process for both Mitzi Hunter as CEO and then Sivan Palvetzian. I was delighted that Rod Phillips succeeded me and proud that he did. And I want to say thank you as well to the board and to what I will tell you is a tiny but outstanding staff team that we have there. I'll make a point of saying that I think during the entire time I was there, there was, I think, one man who was part of it. The rest were all women, which may say something as to the success of this organization. But I just think CivicAction is an outstanding contributor to what we do. The CivicAction model, and it's been referred to a number of times obviously this morning, it's well known to me, it is built on the identification of things that other people aren't doing, the achievement of measurable results, but more so than anything else, the CivicAction model, of course, is built on collaboration. And today, as we have the growing challenges we're all familiar with, and again, they've been referred to this morning, with the coincidence of diminishing resources, a higher premium than ever is placed on collaboration, which is one of the reasons that I have and I will continue to play an active role as the Mayor of Toronto in the well-being of this region, not just the City of Toronto, because to me, the two things are linked together. So I want to be very clear to you, speaking here this morning, that I will, during the time I'm the Mayor, look at things within the following context. My first responsibility is obviously to the well-being of the City of Toronto. But I also believe that a big part of that comes from the fact that what's good for Mississauga or Markham or Richmond Hill or Pickering is good for Toronto and vice versa. I will try to demonstrate my commitment to the region anytime I can, both because it reflects the reality of how people live their lives. They don't much care when they're coming to work every day, whether they're sort of on Brampton Transit or Toronto Transit, or whether they're crossing the border or not. They're unaware of much of that. They just want to get to and from work easily. But I also will focus on my commitment to the region because we live together in a region where what's good for one is good for all. And that is why, for example, I spoke up last week to support the province's funding of the Mississauga-Brampton LRT, because there was a discussion arising which I thought wasn't healthy about whether funding for a Brampton-Mississauga LRT somehow was happening at the expense of the City of Toronto. And I said, no, we can't look at it that way. The City of Toronto is getting lots of transit investment. We need more, but the bottom line is we're getting lots, but it's also important for Brampton and Mississauga as part of this region to have transit investment, because there are people who live in this region and work in this region, including some who live here, who need to use that LRT. It is why It is why I commend the province's support for regional economic development. I can tell you in and of itself a direct result of your recommendations at the last summit and the activism of CivicAction that regional investment by the province of Ontario in economic development is taking place. But it's taking place on a regional basis, and it's going to be good for the entire region, including the City of Toronto. Now, I'm encouraged by some of the signs we saw last week. I'm not going to talk about our budget. I will spare you that. I won't mention that we invested $100 million historically in public transit in the city this year. I won't mention the millions of dollars we put into student nutrition. I won't go into any of that, but I will say that I was encouraged by some of the signs of collaboration I saw last week by the other governments. I've alluded to transit in referring to Brampton and Mississauga, and I will particularly mention the provincial support contained in the budget for SmartTrack. SmartTrack, I believe in my heart, will be transformative in 416, and it is something that can be done soon because a large part of it, most of it, is being built on existing GO train tracks. But it also offers evidence of my commitment to the region and my understanding that we are all one region, because SmartTrack, of course, begins and ends in 905, and most of its route runs through the 416. And that is because it isn't about a line on a map. It isn't about a municipal boundary. It is about fundamentally what transit has to be, which is connecting people to each other and connecting people to jobs. And so I'm very pleased to be working with the Wynne government, and I make no apologies for the fact that I have a good working relationship, and we will continue to make sure that is maintained to move SmartTrack and other transit initiatives forward. Now, federally, Lisa Raitt herself said that the federal government can be seen as the black hats from time to time, but I will point this out, and I had no hesitation in pointing it out last week either. For the first time in the 148-year history of our country, we saw established a permanent national public transit fund, which will soon reach $1 billion a year. And people commented. People commented on the fact it wasn't enough or it wasn't coming fast enough and so on. And of course, that's all true. You'd have 4 times as much, 4 times as soon if you possibly could. But to me, I was heartened by the fact that there was such a fund established. The first time any government of any stripe in our history has acknowledged a responsibility for public transportation in our cities, and I think that is a step forward. I think it will make a difference in terms of our ability as cities and regions to plan, and I think it will see the federal government become, in actual fact, a major partner in transit on a permanent basis as opposed to what we had before. Now, on the housing front, things aren't moving ahead as quickly as I would like to see and as quickly as we require. We have to keep working to make that happen, and I pledge to you to do so. But I will say that the 2 budgets did something that will help, provincially with homeless initiatives and federally with interest relief on CMHC mortgages. These are things that will be of some help, but I think, again, we need to establish a better and more robust partnership going forward because the housing problem is just too big to be borne by property taxpayers alone. I am, in the midst of all this encouraging news, troubled, quite frankly, by our inability to form effective funded partnerships to really make a significant difference in what is nothing short of an affordable housing crisis, especially in this city region. While both governments have moved on transit, as I mentioned, we don't yet have the kind of truly coordinated, collaborative approach for affordable housing that we so urgently need in this region, and that includes the needs of seniors in the housing area, which you're going to be discussing today. Addressing the growing gap between those who are outside looking in and those who aren't is, to me, job one for all of us. I say that as a moral obligation, as many who don't have equitable access to opportunity are disproportionately people as well from racialized communities or newcomers to the GTA, or in some cases both. It is only right for them, for us to give them that little bit of extra support, which is all they're asking for, in order to have a chance to be everything they can be and to really follow what we would see as being the Canadian dream. And they just sometimes need that little bit of extra help that will help them to stay in school or to gain employment or some combination of those kinds of things. But you know, in this instance, if the moral argument doesn't work, and it should, especially with us as Canadians, then I move on to what I believe to be a rock-solid business case. Within the competitive and demographic realities of the 21st century, we simply can't afford to leave people behind. So we should act now to give marginalized people greater access to opportunity, and the same is true for affordable housing. I often, in my talks about this, often a moral case, I even sometimes feel it's helpful to offer an explanation to people who don't understand the difference between social housing and affordable housing. But the bottom line is that there is also a business case which simply recognizes the fact that there are many people we need to work in the GTA for whom it is not practical to commute and whose jobs do not produce an income sufficient for them to afford decent housing in our growing, expensive city region. Again, a little bit of support will go a long way to addressing that reality. And we announced some initiatives that we're going to provide as a city government, hopefully in partnership with the other governments yesterday, to try to move this forward, because we haven't been moving it forward. But the one bottom line is very clear. We need those people to work in our city, and they need those jobs. And we need to make sure that there's a proper place for them to live within the context of a city region like this. Now, more money is obviously needed from the two governments who collect those sources of revenue which grow with the economy. It is not fair or viable to place the entire burden for the responsibility for housing of any kind, for seniors, affordable housing, public housing, onto the backs of property taxpayers. So if we can't get the money right away, and I'm advocating for that each and every day, then more flexibility and more willingness to innovate and more collaboration on the part of those governments would be a good start. I said yesterday, for example, that if we're going to put up, which we're doing, city land, to say we will put that in as a contribution we will make to try to stimulate the private sector and the nonprofit sector to build more affordable housing, why can't the other governments who, as you know, own tons of land around here do the same thing? The province currently contributes, another example, considerable funds to subsidize shelters in Toronto, and that amount is growing. The City of Toronto alone spends $138 million a year on emergency shelters and $400 million on other expenditures related to social housing. I am one who believes that cities and regions must be given greater flexibility and latitude to use some of that money to incent the building of permanent, affordable housing now, so that we are not. And that includes seniors, because we are now beginning to rely on what we call emergency shelters as what really amounts to permanent housing for people, if we're being honest about this. And I see the figures, and they disturb me about the tenure that a lot of people have in that housing, which is getting into months and years, and that's not emergency shelter anymore. We need greater flexibility and willingness to innovate using this money, and I will say we need a much more intensive involvement by the private and nonprofit housing development community, because they have the expertise and the ingenuity to help take that money and try some things that I'm convinced can work. So just yesterday, we announced a toolbox of speedier approvals and deferred charges and dedication of city-owned land for affordable housing, which I hope will benefit the seniors community as well as others who are in need of that affordable housing. And we need these other governments now to step up with similar measures of their own, including some of the dedication of their own land and some use of the tax system to help make this housing happen. You know, I look at even something like tax changes on their part as a win-win, because if the tax breaks are used to build the housing, then we'll have the housing that we need. If the tax breaks aren't used, we'll have to go back to the drawing board, but the governments won't be out any money. So at the end of the day, it's not going to be a failed experiment. It might be failed in terms of the tax breaks not being successful, but it's not going to be a costly failed experiment. I also think the rest of the community has a big part to play in addressing the affordable housing crisis. I look at a program like Calgary's City-led Resolve program, which is seeking, under city leadership, $120 million from 10 community organizations which have an interest in affordable housing. And that money will be supplemented by governments and by the private sector, and will support thousands of new units of affordable housing. And I would like to see us mount a similar effort. If that's the scale of what they can do in Calgary, think of what we could do here with the size of this city and the scale of the wealth that is represented in this city, wealth that is represented in the private sector, in the charitable sector, and also in the governments. And I think this would be an ideal civic action type of project, to say that civic action can bring everybody together in the city to say it's time together that we did something. Charitable, community organizations, governments, developers, nonprofit housing people, to build seniors housing, to build affordable housing for everybody. Like mental health, and for that matter some aspects of public space, we have luxuriated in burying our heads in the sand on the matter of seniors housing, despite glaringly obvious demographics showing a crisis in the making. And I'd like to spend a minute on public space if I could, and my comments may well relate more to the Toronto situation as opposed to the region as a whole, but I want to mention it nonetheless. In reading the excellent TD Bank paper that was prepared for this summit, I took positive note, as I'm sure many of you did, to the connection that we know exists between public space, activity levels, and health, all of which I accept. But I want to come at this from a slightly different angle, namely the whole matter of overall quality of life in Toronto in 2015. If price levels and a desire to live where the action is, downtown as it were, are fueling the purchase of a lot of 600-square-foot condominiums that were referred to earlier, and frankly some that are smaller, we had better realize that a very important part of reality goes with that we're not talking half enough about. Those condos have no backyard. Those condos have no front yard. They don't have family rooms. And so, the relatively nearby provision of green space, and we saw it in the video, and I was so glad of that, and the relatively nearby provision of activity space, which includes libraries and rec centers and so on, is even more crucial. It's not something that's nice to have, which is the way we might have looked at it in previous times with a previous city. It is a must-have. And I will say to you, I believe there has been a lack of discipline and a lack of will to act on requiring these public spaces to be in place on a timely basis. One of the reasons I inserted myself into the discussion of proposed Toronto school closures was because I recognize the fact, I believe as you do, these are not just schools, they are existing, vital public spaces within our community. And when I saw the headline from a council meeting last summer saying 750 stories of development approved in one meeting, I knew the city couldn't have, at the same time, ensured, not just wished about or talked about, ensured the proper amount of parkland, recreation space, or school space was being made available at the same time as that development. On the theory that it isn't Toronto alone which faces this challenge, perhaps CivicAction could, again, arising out of this summit, oversee some kind of a friendly competition. We did it successfully with the race to reduce on energy consumption and got people together who hadn't sat at the table before and said it is in our collective interest to reduce the consumption of energy in commercial buildings. And the program was a great success. And surely we could take some measure of how we're doing or not doing at the provision of public space and actually say we're going to look at this and we're going to measure it in 5 years and in 10 years and we're going to measure it across Toronto and Peel and York and Durham and say that we're going to do better because we have to do better as demographics change and as the nature of people's housing changes. Before saying a few words about jobs, which aren't per se on the agenda, I just wanted to add my voice for a minute to the discussion on mental health. I have been outspoken on this as a provincial politician and as a broadcaster and as a citizen activist. And I only hope you can help me and help other public sector leaders and help business and help education to set some goals to move the yardsticks again on mental health. I say again because I think the early movers, and George Cope and Bell were mentioned earlier, Clara Hughes was mentioned, Mike Wilson should be mentioned, Michael Kirby should be mentioned. These were some of the early movers who helped to begin the process of destigmatizing mental health and at least start some public discussion on this topic. But dare I say, there might now be some stalling. We're really good at this in this country and in this city, perhaps because we get lauded so often, and properly so, but we're really good at standing back and admiring our work after we've taken the first few steps on something and saying we can afford to take a rest. And we can't on mental health, because whether it's workplace accommodation, whether it's improved addiction programs, assisted housing, of which there is far, far too little, and that contributes a huge amount to the homeless problems and to the shelter expenditures I was referring to earlier on, whether it's more sensitive policing or dramatically improved public education, I am committing myself to acting with others to do much, much better. We have badly let down those with illnesses of the brain. And I will leave you with just this one thought to perhaps galvanize us and galvanize you in your discussions today. Think of what would be said if we let down people that had heart ailments. This is simply an illness of the brain. And if we let down people with heart ailments the same way, think of what would be said about us and about each other in that regard. And so I urge you to think about that, and I pledge myself to working with you in the days and months ahead to address this in a more fulsome way. Finally, I want to just say, in conclusion, a few words about jobs. I believe that access to opportunity lies at the root of what we must do to ensure the greatness of this city region. I mentioned earlier on that there are still in our region, and this is so fundamentally inconsistent with CivicAction values, with Toronto values, with Canadian values, there are still far too many people in this city region, as great as we are, who are on the outside looking in. And I believe the reason why our city and our city region does so well in all the lists published as to a place to work, a place to live, and so on, is not because of, certainly not the weather, it's not the performance of our sports teams, it's not even any part of the physical beauty, although there are many things to be treasured in Toronto. I think people look at the way we live together here. They look at the way we live together, how we have embraced people from all over the world, that we live peacefully and harmoniously together, that we look after each other. The world admires how we live together, but I think it also should be behind our own efforts to make sure that nobody gets left behind, because that is what is in our hearts, and that's what we believe, and that's a part of our values. I don't think we ever intend to leave people behind or even accept it as some kind of inevitability. But the fact is that it is a reality for far too many people, a growing number of people in our city region, and there are concentrations among those from racialized communities and newcomers, concentrations of people finding themselves in that position that are higher. And that is something that should deeply trouble us as well. This is not a problem that's going to solve itself, nor can it be solved by government alone. And that is why it is such an opportune thing to be discussed by CivicAction, because it is something that is going to require the ultimate in collaboration and in cooperation and in proactivity. A couple of weeks ago, Starbucks announced they would recruit 10% of their new hires this year through the city's most successful youth employment program, which is called PAY. A number of you in this room are supporters of that program. PAY draws its clients from some of the most disadvantaged neighborhoods in Toronto. That was a landmark commitment by one corporation. And I'm out now, I've issued something I called the 10% Challenge, which is to invite other organizations and corporations to join that 10% challenge. And just that one small step alone, to say that we, as a corporation, are going to dedicate 10% of our new hires this year to people that are coming and drawn and selected and screened from the disadvantaged neighborhoods by the PAY program, will make a huge difference to, yes, directing some of our efforts where they are most required in order to give those people that little bit of a hand up they need in order to not only let us be true to our values, but to do something that is going to build a greater city. It's going to build a greater city. And so I would ask you again to find ways in which CivicAction and yourselves and other local governments can join this 10% challenge. I will just conclude again by saluting CivicAction, Sivan Palvetzian, who is such a caring, collegial, and competent leader, as we knew she would be. Rod Phillips, who I said I was proud to see succeed me as chair because he's a balanced, thoughtful person who will do a good job for this organization. And I want to say thank you to you who've taken the time and the trouble to come here and spend a whole day contributing to the well-being of this city region. Your interest and activism is a giant beacon of hope for our region, which really is one of the most blessed places on earth to live. And I think that what we have to remind ourselves is it didn't get that way by accident. It got that way because we had values that underlay everything we did. It got that way because we had meetings like this where we decided to do something to make sure we'd keep it the way that it is. And I know that coming out of this summit and the 4-year action plan that it will produce, that we can continue to work together, and I pledge myself to do so to make sure we can keep it one of the most blessed places on earth in which to live. Thank you very much.